Hello, I'm John Butler of Hypnotherapy Training International, and I'd like to talk quickly to you about anxiety and hypnotherapy. How does hypnotherapy help people with this very common problem? I'm often asked about this, and our students want to learn about it because they have so many clients who come to see them with that problem. It's a very universal, we would say, human emotion that alerts us to deal with dangers and threats. There are many kinds of anxieties, and linked with that, we have phobias and fears. But anxiety is often seen more as this diffuse emotion, which contains other emotions often within it. It's hard to pin down exactly all the feelings that are involved in it. It's often associated, though, with major feelings like depression, and about around 90% of people have depression, of anxiety, and vice versa. It also often is linked with anger, frustration of various kinds. It tends to be very strong in some people, often in ways that are strange. You can have people, and I've worked a lot with military people over the years who've been in combat zones and who are frightened of things that are very innocuous. So we're talking about a feeling that is the thing that bothers people about is these irrational, extreme anxieties, apprehension, trepidation about things that really don't require that level of emotion or attention, even. And the paradox often is, instead of it being this wonderful survival mechanism, which it can be, and which we hear a lot about, helping us deal with the dangers, and we have the fight, flight, freeze responses, of course, as well, and the more extreme fear reactions and the stress reaction. But in everyday life, it often gets in our way. It really undermines us. And some people seem more prone to it than others, not only because of their programming in the past, and sometimes the seeds of those anxieties that are so irrational and counterproductive, counter life, are sown in infancy. There's other factors, of course, genetics that play a role in it, and the treatments reflect that as well. There's a lot of emphasis on drugs for anxiety, along with psychotherapy methods, psychological therapies, including hypnotherapy, benzodiazepines. The benzodiazepines were very much a drug in the past, less so nowadays used for this. SSRIs and many of the more modern drugs, pregabalin and so on. There's quite a few modern drugs that can help people with the problem, but you can't simply drug yourself out of it for most people. And the side effects of the drugs often are not insignificant in affecting them in their lives. People often use alcohol, and street drugs to help with their anxieties. Now, but if we face the fear, we have to look at the problem as it really is and deal with that. It may be a very practical thing we have to deal with. And paradoxically, our anxieties are not helping us with it. As it's often said, fear often makes you do the things you don't want to do. It stops you doing the things you want to do. It can be very counterproductive. The irony or tragic irony in many cases is that many people spend a lot of their time and energy worrying, anxious about things that don't actually happen, and in the process neglect things they really need to put attention and energy into dealing with. So it's often very counterproductive instead of being this survival mechanism. Now, let's look at some of the most common fears, because we don't have to go into here all the medical labels of the different kinds of anxieties. But just to say a few very briefly, the most common form, the generalized anxiety disorder, we have social anxiety disorder, separation anxiety disorder, panic disorders of various kinds. And then we often have it linked with PTSD and triggering and linked with various obsessional compulsive reactions in people as well. So anxiety plays into many, many kinds of mental problems within that broad label of anxiety, but also triggering other emotional problems as well. Most problems that therapists deal with in everyday practice have a lot to do with fear and anxiety. So the most common ones we often hear people worrying about are fear of illness, of aging, of death, of poverty. They're very practical in some respects, because who wants to be ill? Who wants to have to deal with the financial pain consequences, the deterioration of health, and so on and on. However, if we're just focusing with fear into the problem, we're only exacerbating things. And in ways that we really don't quite understand how it works, fear seems to create the very problem we don't want. There's an old saying back in the scriptures, Lord, what I feared most has come upon me, the book of Job. And there's many similar references in other philosophies and religious traditions. So what we're looking at, how we can deal with these different kinds of fears. And the fears are not just of that more practical, such as financial aging and so on. There's the fears of not being good enough, fear of failure, fear of success, fear of being unlovable, which is a common one, often linked with the fear of rejection, which causes us to be kind of become approval seekers and captive of other people's opinions and so on. So there's a great deal of problems that emerges from our lack of conquering our fears, these unnecessary anxieties and fears. So we need to understand this process of anxiety properly. And this is one of the things we teach in our courses in hypnotherapy. It's a big project for your life because it's often said the biggest enemy for most of us is going to be within, and it'll use fear. The fear will stop us doing things we need to do and so on. It can paralyze talent. It can keep us stuck. So in that freeze mode, or cause us to retreat from problems, always running. So we need to understand the way the subconscious uses fear against us, where it's now become counterproductive, getting in our way and sort of seems to create its own negative mechanisms within itself. So we have fear of fear and so on to the panic level. And as somebody once said, fear in so many ways is an illusion that we create ourselves. We're frightening ourselves. Somebody once said, it's like looking in the mirror and making ugly faces at yourself, scaring ourselves, wherein we become the captive. We're in a jail, which we as a kind of punitive or corrupt judge and jury, lawyers for that matter, we put ourselves in there, into this jail. We spend our lives in a jail of fear, living in fear, dying in fear, without ever really pushing through those fears to see what's beyond them, because it does have a value if we can understand them, not only mastering the problems that we're afraid of, but understanding the mechanism, turning fear into something that's appropriate, useful for our lives. Many people who are frightened of things, we can turn that very often from nervousness, such as about the fear of public speaking, into excitement, using the fears and the threats that we're afraid of as challenges. So there's many aspects to understand about this, which is why learning on a course, such as one of our advanced analytical courses, or in fact any of our courses, will teach you about how to trigger the subconscious mind to use fear positively, constructively, and also to diminish it or eradicate it even where it's completely unnecessary. Because many of our fears are subconscious. They're irrational, non-logical, and they can be therefore deprogrammed. Maybe sometimes we have to go a bit deep to get to the deeper roots and significance of them, but that can be done as well. That's analytical regression and reprogramming hypnotherapy. So there's much to understand about fear. It's not as straightforward as people often make it out, including in the psychology textbooks, because you're going deep into the psyche as to what the fear represents sometimes. And that's a journey of discovery and self-mastery. So we are going to tackle these very powerful forces of the mind, fear, which also works with its close colleague, doubt, which create between them another monster of our lives, is indecision, failure to take action because we're constantly doubting our ability to succeed, fear of failure, fear of success, fear we're not good enough, fear we're unworthy, and so on and on. So we need to break out of that subconscious pattern. And hypnosis gives us, again, keys and tools, the deep, full practice of hypnotherapy, not just learning a few of the many fragmented ideas that come from hypnotherapy into the popular psychology, because that's where they've come from. We are learning the deeper mechanisms of the mind, how the brain works with fear. Hypnosis takes us into the mind and the brain to make the synaptic changes, to really rewire things. Now, in the process, we'll be confronting the real dangers and threats more effectively, maybe learning to relax, deal with the physical sensations, which are often those feeling more like we're shaking, trembling, sweating, tense, maybe gut feelings that are problematic, the tensions and anxieties that come from being living in a state of anxiety permanently, creating more and more anxieties, like sowing the seeds that flower into a million horrible types of anxieties. We are then, as it were, captives of those. We are held back greatly in our lives. So we want to make sure we are not the slave, the victim of our own fears, of ourselves. So we learn that in hypnotherapy, we have choices and we can confront the physical symptoms, the emotional patterns, the problems themselves, and release then the courage, which is the other side of the polarity, because the energy of life can be expressed towards fear or towards courage. And the most timid person in the world, therefore, in the final analysis, all the courage of the most capable, heroic person out there in life. So it's an important project for our lives to learn and understand about fear, its dark side, its positive aspects, and so on. Now, along with using fear, we're going to learn to confront much of our self-image, self-concept. That's another talk in itself. As we go into that, we'll be learning more about the triggers and causes and how we can reverse that. Because at the end of the day, again, mostly it's programming has got us into the state of how we are over time, because we didn't face our fears. We lived in almost terror of them. They bully us, they're parasitic on us, they're stopping us living our lives. And so hypnotherapy takes a very proactive, aggressive even approach, I would say, to dealing with fear. So we don't spend our lives being manipulated by them, again, by ourselves, and also the sociopathic element out there in the world of politics, in the world of even professional practice. In many ways, the toxic marketers who will tell us, there's scarcity here, you better buy it now, you'll never get this deal again. So there's all kinds of ways we are manipulated by people who know how to use fear. They don't have to use it with a threat of violence. They can just use it very effectively, psychologically, to bend us to their ideologies, their wills. And if you look at the history of the kind of feudal state of humanity, it's sometimes been better and sometimes worse. You'll see that people were really very often just held captive by imagination in the form of anxieties and fears that didn't turn out the way their captors, their sociopathic oppressors predicted or programmed them to believe, at least. And so it's up to us to make our minds clear, precise, to have a scientific, practical orientation to our fears, to life, to be able to use all of our emotional power, all of our subconscious power, so it's not used against us, and to be able to take our lives into a whole other level of confidence, belief, courage, bravery, all of the other ends of the polarity of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum from fear, courage, and so on. Now, I hope this has given you some insights. It's a very short overview. Again, we go into these in a lot of detail, these principles, and teach people how to use individualized programming to tackle fears, and also how to eradicate the deeper roots of the fear, where it's got us really caught in a very powerful synaptic loops over the years, which it's not possible to just break out of it cognitively, at least not enough. They can be helpful, the CBT, which we use as part of it, but for the very deeper fears, you've got to go right down into the subconscious and do a lot of good programming to reverse the triggers and the history of this. So there's so much to understand here. and so much to benefit from by looking into your own experiences internally of fear, doubt, indecision, and so on, and taking your life to a whole other level of self-expression, free of contamination with fear and doubts and worries. Please get in touch with any time you want to find out more about our training courses. Hypnotherapytraininginternational.com is the website. We have a next course coming up in a few weeks on analytical hypnotherapy, as it turns out, which will take you to a whole other way of looking at the internal process of the mind so you can reprogram and deprogram yourself. You become the person who writes their own scripts in life. Thank you very much for listening and watching.